On the 16th of October 1905, in a single administrative stroke, the largest province of British India was divided in two. The Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, had ordered that the Bengal Presidency, which administered approximately 78 million people across a territory roughly the size of Western Europe, would be split along a line drawn by his administrators in Calcutta. The reason given was administrative efficiency. The reaction across the cities and villages of Bengal and then across India was a political earthquake, whose aftershocks would shape the next 4 decades of South Asian history. Within months, the Indian National Congress, which until 1905 had been a polite club of educated Indian elites petitioning the British government for modest reforms, had transformed into a mass political movement demanding genuine self-government. Within 42 years, the British Empire in India would be gone. The partition of Bengal is one of those events that gets reduced in Western history textbooks to a footnote in the broader story of Indian independence. But the footnote misses what was actually at stake. What happened in 1905 was the moment when the Indian independence movement crystallized from a constitutional petition campaign into a mass political mobilization, and when the British colonial state in India first began to lose the political legitimacy that had sustained it for nearly 150 years. The methods that emerged from the Swadeshi movement against the partition, the boycotts, the indigenous goods campaigns, the mass marches, the use of cultural symbols to mobilize political loyalty would later be refined by Mahatma Gandhi into the techniques that brought British rule to an end. All of this began with a single administrative decision made by an autocratic viceroy who believed he was solving a routine governance problem. Let's walk through how a single administrative decision sparked the modern Indian independence movement. First, at the level set, the partition of Bengal did not appear out of nowhere. It was the product of a particular British colonial strategic doctrine applied to a province that the British found administratively challenging and politically threatening. The Bengal Presidency, as it existed in 1905, was an enormous administrative unit. It included the modern Indian states of West Bengal, Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, and the modern country of Bangladesh. The total population was approximately 78 million people. The capital, Calcutta, was also the capital of British India itself, the political and commercial center of the entire South Asian empire. By the early 20th century, the British administration in Calcutta was struggling with the scale of governing this territory. The single lieutenant governor of Bengal was responsible for more people than most independent European nations contained. More importantly, Bengal had become the center of a new kind of Indian political activity that worried the British administration. Bengali intellectuals, many educated in English universities and exposed to European political philosophy, were developing a sophisticated critique of British colonial rule. The Indian National Congress, founded in Bombay in 1885, had its strongest organizational base in Bengal, Bengali newspapers. Both English language and Bengali language were the most aggressive in challenging British policies. Bengali poets and intellectuals were creating a cultural nationalism that connected ancient Hindu and Indian traditions to modern claims for self-government. George Curzon, the Viceroy of India from 1899 to 1905, was the type of British colonial administrator who believed deeply in the moral mission of empire and equally deeply in the importance of efficient administration. He was 39 years old when he became Viceroy. He had served in the British cabinet under Lord Salisbury. He had traveled extensively in Asia. He believed with the confidence of his class and his era that British rule in India was a civilizing project that properly conducted would benefit the Indian population for generations to come. He also believed with equal conviction that the Indian National Congress was an unrepresentative club of educated Babu lawyers and clerks who did not actually speak for the Indian masses. In Curzon's view, the proper response to Bengali political agitation was twofold. One, the British administration should be reformed to be more responsive to genuine Indian concerns. 2. The political effectiveness of the Bengali agitators should be reduced through administrative reorganization that would weaken their geographic base. The proposal to partition Bengal had been discussed in British administrative circles since the 1862. Various plans had been floated, debated, and abandoned over the decades. The proposal that Curzon adopted in 1903 had specific features that connected administrative efficiency to political strategy. Under Curzon's plan, the existing Bengal Presidency would be divided into two new units. The first, called the Province of Bengal, would consist of West Bengal proper plus Bihar and Odisha, with its capital at Calcutta. The second, called Eastern Bengal and Assam, would consist of East Bengal plus the existing province of Assam with its capital at Dhaka, modern Dhaka. The population of the second province would be approximately 31 million people, of whom roughly 18 million would be Muslim and 13 million Hindu. The population of the first province would be approximately 54 million, of whom about 42 million would be Hindu and approximately 12 million Muslim. The political logic of Curzon's plan behind the administrative justification was clear to anyone who studied the demographic and political map. The Bengali-speaking Hindu population, which had been the demographic base of the Indian National Congress in Bengal and the source of the most aggressive political agitation, would be divided. Approximately a third of the politically active Bengali Hindus would find themselves living in the new province of Eastern Bengal and Assam, where they would be a numerical minority under a Muslim majority administration. The remaining two-thirds in the new province of Bengal would have their political influence diluted by being grouped with the populations of Bihar and Odisha, who were demographically and politically distinct. The plan, in effect, was a sophisticated piece of colonial gerrymandering designed to weaken the political base of Indian nationalism by reorganizing the geography of representation. When the plan was made public in 1903 and 1904, the response was immediate and intense. Bengali newspapers, both English language and Bengali language, denounced the proposal as a deliberate attempt to weaken Indian nationalism. Public meetings were held across Bengal. Petitions with thousands of signatures were submitted to the British government. The Indian National Congress passed resolutions condemning the proposal at its annual sessions. The British government in London received the protests, considered them, and proceeded with the partition. The implementation date was set for the 16th of October 1905. The 16th of October 1905 was declared a day of national mourning across Bengal. The forms of protest that emerged that day were unlike anything previous Indian political activity had produced. In the morning, large crowds of Bengali men, women, and children walked to the banks of the Ganges River and bathed together. The bathing was a traditional Hindu purification ritual, deliberately repurposed for political symbolism. After bathing, the participants tied Raksha Bandhan, a traditional Hindu wristband symbolizing protective brotherhood, on each other's wrists. The visual message was unmistakable. The Bengali population, both Eastern and Western, both Hindu and Muslim, where they chose to participate, were declaring themselves one community despite the administrative line that had been drawn across their land. The day was named Rakhi Bandhan. The ritual would be repeated annually for years. In Calcutta and other Bengali cities, a different form of protest took shape that same day. Crowds gathered in public squares and ceremonially burned imported British textiles. This was the visible beginning of the Swadeshi movement, from the Bengali word meaning of one's own country. The principle was straightforward. Indians would boycott British-made goods, particularly textiles, and would commit themselves to producing and consuming Indian-made products instead. The economic significance was enormous. British textile manufacturing, particularly the cotton mills of Lancashire, had been the central economic relationship between Britain and India for over a century. Lancashire cotton was sold in India in vast quantities. If a substantial part of the Indian market boycotted British cloth, British industrial profits would suffer directly. The political significance was even greater. The Swadeshi movement gave the Indian National Congress a mass mobilizing strategy. For the first time, anyone could participate in a boycott. Anyone could choose to wear Indian spun cloth instead of British manufactured cloth. The movement reached deep into the social structure of Bengali society in a way that earlier petition campaigns had not. The cultural mobilization that accompanied the political protest was equally significant. The poet Rabindranath Tagore, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, composed songs and poems to be sung at the protest gathering. One of his compositions, Amar Sona Bangla, meaning My Golden Bengal, became an anthem of the movement. It is, to this day, the national anthem of Bangladesh. The slogan Bande Mataram, meaning I bow to thee, mother, drawn from the 1882 novel Anandamath by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, became the rallying cry of the movement. It was painted on banners, shouted in public meetings, sung at the openings and closings of political rallies. The slogan was, and remains, controversial within the Indian Muslim community because the novel from which it was drawn portrayed Muslim characters in unflattering ways and used Hindu religious imagery as the foundation of its nationalism. But for the Hindu majority of Bengal in 1905, Bande Mataram was the verbal signature of the new political mood. Within weeks, the protests had spread from Bengal to other parts of India. Public meetings were held in Bombay, in Madras, in Lahore, in cities across the subcontinent. The Indian National Congress, at its annual session in December of 1905, formally adopted the Swadeshi boycott as its political strategy. Its newer and more radical leaders, including Bal Gangadhar Tilak in Maharashtra, Lala Lajpat Rai in Punjab, and Bipin Chandra Pal in Bengal, the so-called Lal Bal trio, openly called for a transformation of the Congress from a petitioning club into a mass political movement aimed at Swaraj, meaning self-rule. The older, more moderate Congress leadership, including Gopal Krishna Gokal and Ferozesha Mehta, were uncomfortable with this radicalism and worried about its implications. But the political energy of the moment was clearly with the radicals. The British administration's response to the Swadeshi movement evolved through several phases between 1905 and 1908, and each phase intensified rather than reduced the political conflict. The initial British response was relatively measured. Curzon left office in November of 1905, replaced by Lord Minto. The new Viceroy and his Secretary of State for India in London, John Morley, attempted to combine continued enforcement of the partition with limited political concessions. In 1909, this combination produced the Morley-Minto reforms, which expanded the elected element in Indian legislative councils and provided separate electorates for Muslims, ensuring that Muslim voters would elect Muslim representatives to legislative bodies. The introduction of separate electorates for Muslims was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential British policy decisions of the entire colonial period. It institutionalized religious community as the basic unit of political representation in India. And it deepened the political distinction between Hindu and Muslim Indians in ways that would shape every subsequent decade of South Asian history. The British policy of dividing political loyalties along religious lines, which had been implicit in the partition of Bengal itself, was now formalized in the structure of Indian political representation. At the same time, the British administration was tightening its repression of the political movement. In 1908, the Newspaper Act and the Indian Press Act gave the colonial administration broad powers to suppress newspapers that incited disaffection against the government. In the same year, the Explosive Substances Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act gave the administration expanded powers to detain political activists. Public meetings were banned in many districts. Bengali leaders were arrested, deported, or detained without trial. The newspaper editor Bipin Chandra Pal, who had been one of the most aggressive advocates of the Swadeshi movement, was imprisoned. The radical Congress leader Bal Gangadhar Tilak was sentenced to 6 years of transportation in Burma in July of 1908 after being convicted of sedition based on articles he had published in his Marathi language newspaper. Even more troubling for the British administration was the emergence of a violent revolutionary fringe alongside the broader political movement. Beginning in 1907 and 1908, small groups of Bengali revolutionary activists carried out bombings, assassinations, and armed robberies in pursuit of more radical change. The Anushilan Samiti and Jugantar groups, which had begun as physical culture and self-improvement societies in the 1892, transformed into clandestine revolutionary organizations. In 1908, young Bengali revolutionaries Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chaki attempted to assassinate a particularly disliked British magistrate Douglas Kingsford in the town of Muzaffarpur in Bihar. Their bomb missed the magistrate but killed 2 British women instead. Khudiram Bose, then 18 years old, was captured and executed by hanging. Prafulla Chaki shot himself to avoid capture. These executions and the broader revolutionary violence pushed the British administration further toward repression, while making martyrs of the executed revolutionaries among the broader Bengali population. By 1910 and 1911, the British administration had concluded that the partition of Bengal had become politically counterproductive. The administrative benefits, if any, had been overwhelmed by the political costs. The Indian National Congress had transformed from a manageable elite organization into a mass political movement. The Swadeshi boycott was causing measurable damage to British textile exports. The cycle of repression and resistance was producing diminishing returns for the British. In December of 1911, at the Great Delhi Durbar, marking the coronation of King George V, the British government made 2 major announcements. First, the partition of Bengal was reversed. The province would be reunified, although Bihar, Odisha, and Assam would be separated as new provinces in their own right. Second, the capital of British India would be moved from Calcutta to a new city to be built at Delhi. The reversal of the partition was a public acknowledgement that the British policy had failed. It was the first time in the modern history of the British Empire in India that a major colonial policy had been reversed under the explicit pressure of organized Indian political activity. The reversal of the partition in 1911 did not end the political dynamics that the partition had set in motion. It actually accelerated them. Consequence 1. The Indian National Congress had been transformed into a mass political movement. Before 1905, the Congress had been a club of educated lawyers, journalists, and merchants who met once a year, passed resolutions, and submitted petitions to the British government. After 1908, the Congress had local branches across India, organized boycott campaigns. Mobilized students and women used cultural symbols to build political identity and pursued a strategy of confrontation with the colonial state. This transformation, which the Swadeshi movement made possible, would later be deepened and broadened by Mahatma Gandhi after his return to India from South Africa in 1915. Gandhi's mass nonviolent resistance campaigns of the 1920 seconds, 1930 seconds, and 1940 seconds, the non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement, the Quit India movement, all built on the organizational and tactical foundations laid by the Swadeshi response to the partition of Bengal. Gandhi himself acknowledged the Swadeshi movement as one of the formative influences on his political philosophy. Consequence 2. The separation of Muslim and Hindu political identities was institutionalized. The Muslim League had been founded in Dhaka in 1906. Partly in response to the Swadeshi movement's perceived Hindu cultural character and partly with British encouragement. The 1909 Morley Minto reforms institutionalized separate Muslim electorates. Over the following 4 decades, the distinction between Indian Muslim and Indian Hindu political identities deepened, supported by deliberate British policy, by the political strategies of various Indian leaders, and by the geographic and demographic realities of South Asia. The eventual partition of India in 1947, which created the separate states of Pakistan and India, drew on political and constitutional structures that had been laid down beginning in the period of the Bengal partition. The line that Curzon's administrators had drawn through Bengal in 1905 was not in any direct sense the same line that ran between India and East Pakistan in 1947, but the political logic that drew the first line and the political reactions it produced contributed substantially to the conditions that drew the second. Consequence 3. The political tradition of mass civil disobedience and economic boycott was established as the central strategy of Indian anti-colonial politics. The Swadeshi movement's combination of political demands, economic boycott, and cultural mobilization became the template for every major anti-colonial campaign in India over the following 4 decades. When Gandhi led the Salt March in 1930, he was deploying techniques that had been pioneered in Bengal in 1905. When the Quit India movement was launched in 1942, it built on a quarter century of accumulated experience in mass non-violent resistance. Beyond India, the techniques developed in the Swadeshi movement were studied and adopted by anti-colonial movements across Africa and Asia. The Vietnamese, the Indonesians, the Kenyans, the Algerians, all in different forms, drew lessons from the Indian experience that had begun in Calcutta in 1905. Consequence 4, the political legitimacy of British rule in India was permanently weakened. Before 1905, the British administration had largely operated on the assumption that its rule was accepted by the Indian population, that the educated Indian elite would continue to see constitutional reforms within the framework of empire, and that the broader Indian masses had no significant political role. After 1908, none of these assumptions could be sustained. The British administration had publicly reversed a major policy in the face of organized Indian opposition. The Indian National Congress had become a mass political movement. Bengali revolutionary violence had demonstrated that some Indians were prepared to die for the cause of national independence. The administrative authority of the British colonial state continued. The political legitimacy that had once underwritten that authority did not. From 1911 onward, every British colonial administrator in India had to operate with the awareness that the Indian population could and would resist colonial policy. That resistance could and would be effective, and that the empire's hold on India was, in the long run, finite. Consequence 5, the economic infrastructure of Indian nationalism was strengthened. The Swadeshi movement's emphasis on indigenous goods production led to the development of Indian-owned industrial and commercial enterprises that would later become major economic actors. The Tata Iron and Steel Company, founded in 1907, drew on the Swadeshi movement's emphasis on Indian industrial self-sufficiency. The textile industry, particularly in Bombay and Ahmedabad, expanded in part by selling to the boycott-supportive Indian market. The cooperative movement, the indigenous banking sector, the various Indian commercial associations that emerged in the early 20th century all drew strength from the Swadeshi political environment. When India achieved independence in 1947, it inherited a more substantial indigenous industrial and commercial base than would have existed without the Swadeshi era. The economic foundation of post-independence India was built in part during the political mobilizations of the Swadeshi years. Pull back further, the 1905 partition of Bengal sits at the beginning of a 42-year sequence that ended with the independence and partition of India in August of 1947. The 42 years between 1905 and 1947 contained several major periods of mass political mobilization. The Swadeshi era from 1905 to 1908, the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements from 1919 to 1922, the civil disobedience movement from 1930 to 1934, the Quit India movement of 1942, each of these campaigns built on the techniques and political networks of the previous one. Between these mass mobilizations were periods of constitutional politics and gradual reform. The Government of India Acts of 1909, 1919, and 1935 expanded Indian political participation in stages while maintaining ultimate British control. By the end of the Second World War in 1945, the combination of accumulated political mobilization, British financial exhaustion, and the new global political order made continued British rule in India institutionally unsustainable. The Labour government of Clement Attlee, which came to power in Britain in July of 1945, recognized this reality. In February of 1947, the British government announced that it would transfer power in India by June of 1948. The transfer was eventually accelerated to August of 1947 in part because the new Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, judged that an earlier date would minimize the inevitable violence of the transition. The partition of British India in August of 1947 was, in a sense, the unwilling final chapter of the political dynamics set in motion by the partition of Bengal in 1905. The Muslim League, founded in 1906 partly in response to the Swadeshi movement, had spent 4 decades arguing for separate Muslim political institutions. By the 1942, that argument had hardened into a demand for a separate Muslim majority state. When independence came in 1947, the new state of Pakistan included 2 non-contiguous territorial wings, separated by approximately 1,000 miles of Indian territory. The eastern wing, East Pakistan, consisted of much of the same territory that had been the separate province of eastern Bengal and Assam under Curzon's 1905 plan. In 1971, 24 years later, East Pakistan would secede from Pakistan after a brutal civil war and become the independent nation of Bangladesh. The territorial structure of modern South Asia, with India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as 3 separate states, can be traced through a long causal chain back to the administrative line that Curzon's officials drew through Bengal in 1905. The human costs of the 1947 partition were enormous. Between 10 and 20 million people were displaced as Hindus and Sikhs fled from what became Pakistan to India, and Muslims fled in the opposite direction. Between 500,000 and 2 million people died in communal violence. These were not consequences that anyone at the 1905 partition could have foreseen in any specific way. But the political structures that produced 1947, the separate electorates institutionalized in 1909, the religious community as the basic unit of political identity, the territorial expression of religious community as a political demand, all of these had their formative moment in the conflict over the partition of Bengal. One administrative decision in October of 1905 produced, over 4 decades, the political conditions for one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. What does this episode of history teach? First, administrative decisions are political decisions. Lord Curzon and his officials presented the partition of Bengal as a matter of administrative efficiency. The Indian National Congress and the Bengali public correctly perceived it as a political maneuver. In every era, decisions that are presented as technical or administrative carry political consequences that affect the lives of millions of people. Pretending that such decisions are merely technical is itself a political strategy, one that often backfires by underestimating the political awareness of those affected. The greatest miscalculation Curzon made was not the partition itself. It was his belief that the Bengali political class would not understand what he was doing. Second, suppressing a political movement often accelerates it. The British administration's response to the Swadeshi movement, the press laws, the detentions, the executions, the bans on public meetings, did not eliminate the movement. They radicalized it, gave it martyrs, and expanded its political reach. Repression as a strategy for managing organized political dissent has a limited shelf life. Once a movement has crossed certain organizational and cultural thresholds, additional repression tends to recruit more participants than it deters. This pattern is visible in colonial and post-colonial movements across the 20th century, and it remains visible in the political dynamics of authoritarian responses to organized dissent today. Third, the structure of representation determines the trajectory of politics. The British decision in 1909 to create separate electorates for Muslims may have been intended as a moderate concession to Muslim political concerns. In the long run, it institutionalized religion as the central organizing principle of Indian politics and contributed substantially to the eventual partition of the subcontinent. Decisions about how to organize political representation by individual or by community, by territory or by class, by majority or by proportional rule are among the most consequential decisions any political system makes. Once these structures are set, they shape political incentives for generations, and they are extraordinarily difficult to undo. On the 16th of October 1905, the largest province of British India was divided in 2 by a line that the Viceroy's officials had drawn on a map. Within 6 years, the British administration had reversed the partition. Within 42 years, The British administration in India had ended entirely. Within 66 years, the territory of the original Bengal Presidency had been divided among 3 separate sovereign states. The partition of Bengal was not the cause of all of this. Indian nationalism had deeper roots than the administrative decisions of any single viceroy. The collapse of the British Empire had multiple causes, including the 2 world wars, the rise of American and Soviet power, the global political mood of decolonization. But the partition of Bengal was the catalyzing moment, the event that transformed Indian nationalism from a constitutional petitioning movement into a mass political force. It was the moment when the British colonial administration discovered that it could not simply rearrange the political geography of India by administrative decree. It was the moment when Indian political leaders discovered that mass mobilization, cultural symbolism, economic boycott, and sustained resistance could compel the colonial state to retreat. Both discoveries reshaped the political possibilities of the next 4 decades, and the next 4 decades reshaped the political map of South Asia for at least the next century. When you look at the modern political geography of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you are looking in significant part at the long downstream consequences of an administrative decision that was made in a viceroy's office in Calcutta in 1905. One administrative line drawn for one set of political reasons, producing consequences that no one at the time could have foreseen in their full extent. That is, in one sense, what history actually does. The biggest consequences usually flow from decisions that the decision makers did not understand. They were making, if you want, more episodes that trace the long causal arcs from a single administrative decision to the political geography of the present. Subscribe. There is a lot of history to explain